He walked into a crowded McDonald's, unnoticed at first, but what Barron Trump did next left an entire room of first responders speechless. It was a brisk evening in downtown Cleveland, Ohio, and the local McDonald's on West 25th Street was a hub of activity. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, reflecting off the checkerboard tiled floor as a mix of customers shuffled in and out. Among them were firefighters with soot-streaked faces, EMTs in their navy blue uniforms, and police officers adjusting their gear belts. Their laughter and chatter filled the air as they savored a rare moment of downtime, the exhaustion of their shifts momentarily melting away over burgers and fries. Amid the lively crowd, the glass doors swung open, and in walked a young man, tall and unassuming, dressed in a gray hoodie and dark sneakers. He kept his head low, hands tucked into his pockets, exuding a quiet energy. Some diners glanced his way, noting his strikingly familiar face, but few seemed to register exactly who he was. Barron Trump, former first son, moved toward the counter with a calm demeanor, blending into the crowd as much as someone of his stature could. It wasn't a grand entrance. He didn't seek attention. In fact, it seemed like he was trying to avoid it entirely. He simply got in line, standing behind a firefighter who smelled faintly of smoke. The restaurant hummed with conversations, orders being called out, and the rhythmic sound of the fryer bubbling in the kitchen. It was an ordinary evening for everyone else. But Barron's presence would soon change that. But before anyone could connect the dots, his next move would leave the entire room stunned. The line inched forward, and Barron's turn came quickly. As he stepped up to the counter, the cashier, a young woman with her hair tied back in a ponytail and a practiced smile, greeted him. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering, as if trying to place where she had seen his face before. But Barron's polite nod and calm tone as he placed his order seemed to disarm her curiosity. "Just a moment," she said, punching in the order. Behind him, the firefighter shifted slightly, exchanging banter with his colleague about the day's events. "Man, I thought that roof was going to come down on us," one of them said, shaking his head. Barron glanced back briefly, his eyes catching theirs. A subtle acknowledgement passed between them, not of who he was, but of mutual respect. Nearby tables buzzed with first responders decompressing, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They spoke of the emergencies they'd tackled, the lives they'd saved, and the minor injuries they'd shrugged off, their voices a mixture of pride and fatigue. Barron stood quietly at the counter, listening but not interrupting, as if absorbing the gravity of their stories. It wasn't long before the cashier handed him his receipt and started preparing his drink. Barron leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. The cashier froze for a moment, then her eyes widened. "Are you serious?" she whispered. He nodded, glancing over his shoulder at the tables full of first responders. A slight smile crossed his face, but he quickly turned his attention back to the cashier. Behind the counter, the kitchen staff began moving with more urgency as the cashier relayed the instructions. The crew exchanged glances, some nodding in quiet understanding, while others whispered among themselves, trying to process what they'd just heard. But before the room could grasp what was unfolding, Barron's quiet gesture began to ripple through the crowd. The shift in energy was subtle at first. The cashier, now moving with a bit more excitement, spoke softly to her manager, who raised an eyebrow in surprise before giving a quick nod. The crew began assembling orders with a speed and precision usually reserved for rush hour, though the dining area wasn't overly packed. Something was happening, but most customers were too preoccupied to notice. Barron stood off to the side, sipping his drink, his expression unreadable. He didn't draw attention to himself or seek acknowledgement. Instead, he watched quietly as one by one, the firefighters, EMTs, and police officers approached the counter to pick up their meals. Each time, the cashier smiled and said the same thing. "It's already been taken care of." The first responders hesitated, their brows furrowing in confusion. "By who?" one firefighter asked, glancing around the room. The cashier gestured subtly toward Barron, who remained near the soda fountain, his back turned. When the realization hit, the reactions were varied. Some looked incredulous, as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. Others exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. A young EMT, no older than 25, chuckled and shook his head. "Are you serious?" That kid? Gradually, the dining area fell quieter as more meals were handed out. Conversations about shifts and emergencies faded into whispers about the young man in the hoodie. Barron didn't flinch. He stayed in the background, almost as if he wanted to disappear, but the weight of his gesture began to settle over the room. "He didn't have to do that," one officer muttered, staring at the bag of food in his hands. "He could have just walked in and left like anyone else." By now, everyone had noticed him. A few whispered his name, connecting the dots. "That's Trump's kid, right? Barron?" another firefighter said, his voice low. "What's he even doing here?" No one approached him, though. It wasn't out of fear or intimidation. It was respect. Barron wasn't looking for recognition, and everyone seemed to instinctively understand that. He was simply there, doing something quietly extraordinary. But the humility in his actions was what truly struck everyone, leaving them in a stunned silence they couldn't shake. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the room like an invisible current. First responders, one by one, began to understand the scope of what had just happened. Barron Trump had paid for every meal, quietly covering the cost for people who had just spent their day saving lives and protecting the community. A firefighter at the back of the room leaned over to his colleague. "I don't get it," he muttered. "Why would he do this? He doesn't know us." His colleague shrugged, glancing toward Barron. "Maybe he doesn't need to know us. Maybe that's the point." At the counter, an EMT picked up her order and paused, clutching the warm bag of food. Her eyes drifted toward Barron, a flicker of something unspoken passing across her face. Gratitude? Curiosity? Maybe both. "I've never seen anything like this," she said quietly to the cashier. "It's not every day someone does something like that," the cashier replied, her tone hushed but filled with awe. "Especially someone like him." The room buzzed with a mix of emotions. There was admiration, certainly, but also confusion and disbelief. After all, this wasn't a staged event. There were no cameras, no entourage, no press releases, just a young man who had walked into a McDonald's and done something completely unexpected. One police officer broke the unspoken tension. "Well," he said, raising his soda cup toward Barron, "here's to him, whoever he is." A ripple of laughter spread across the room, breaking the initial awkwardness. Some of the first responders began talking about the gesture openly now, their voices carrying a mix of warmth and curiosity. Barron, hearing the shift in tone, glanced up briefly, but quickly returned to his quiet stance by the window. He wasn't hiding, but he wasn't basking in the attention either. "He could have made a big deal out of it," one firefighter said, unwrapping his burger. "But he didn't. That says a lot." But before anyone could fully process the moment, Barron had already begun making his exit, leaving behind an air of mystery and quiet admiration. As the last of the meals were handed out and the realization settled across the room, Barron finished his drink and glanced toward the door. He adjusted his hoodie slightly, avoiding eye contact with anyone as he began to move toward the exit. The noise in the restaurant had quieted to a low hum, punctuated by occasional murmurs of, "Was that really him?" and "Why would he do this?" Barron didn't linger. He walked with an unhurried pace, his hands still tucked into his pockets. For a moment, it seemed as though he might stop, perhaps to say something, acknowledge the gratitude radiating toward him, but he didn't. Instead, he pushed open the glass door and stepped into the cool evening air. Inside the McDonald's, the first responders remained seated, their meals in front of them, exchanging glances. One firefighter leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You don't see that every day," he said, his tone laced with disbelief, "especially from someone like him." Outside, Barron paused briefly on the sidewalk. He turned his head slightly, as if listening to the muffled conversations inside the restaurant. His expression was hard to read. There was no smugness, no satisfaction, just a quiet thoughtfulness that seemed to weigh heavier than his years. Then, just as quietly as he had entered, he walked away, disappearing into the night. A young EMT near the window watched him go, her thoughts spinning. "You think he even realizes what he just did?" she asked aloud, more to herself than anyone else. "I think he knows," replied an officer from across the table. "But I don't think he cares about the attention. That's what makes it so real." But even as Barron faded from sight, the impact of his gesture lingered, leaving the room to reflect on the unexpected humanity they had just witnessed. The conversations inside the McDonald's shifted from disbelief to something deeper: reflection. First responders who had spent their careers in high-stress situations suddenly found themselves discussing not their work, but the quiet young man who had come and gone like a fleeting moment of kindness. "Did you see his face when he walked out?" asked a paramedic, leaning forward in her seat. "It wasn't about showing off. He really meant it." A firefighter nodded, stirring his coffee. "It's rare, you know. People thank us, sure. But this was different. It wasn't just words." The staff behind the counter had their own buzz of conversations. The cashier, still slightly in shock, recounted the moment Barron leaned in and made his request. "I thought it was a joke at first," she admitted. "But he was serious. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just kindness." Outside the restaurant, word began to spread. A passerby who had recognized Barron posted a quick note on social media. "Just saw Barron Trump at McDonald's paying for first responders' meals. Didn't even stick around for a thank you. Respect." The post gained traction almost immediately, sparking discussions online about privilege, humility, and the unexpected. Back inside, an officer with salt and pepper hair spoke up. "You know, we all wear these uniforms every day, but we don't always feel seen. Tonight, that kid made us feel seen." The ripple effect wasn't just about free meals. It was about the reminder that small gestures, done sincerely, could carry profound meaning. Conversations shifted to their families, their communities, and the quiet moments of gratitude that often went unnoticed in their line of work. "He didn't have to do this," said another EMT, shaking her head. "He could have walked past us and no one would have thought twice, but he didn't." But as they talked, the question lingered. Why had Barron chosen that moment, that place, to show such unexpected generosity? As the conversations wound down and the first responders finished their meals, one theme emerged: gratitude. Not just for the gesture itself, but for the reminder it brought. A reminder that in a world often divided by titles and expectations, humanity could still shine through in the simplest of ways. The young EMT who had watched Barron leave leaned back in her chair, a soft smile playing on her lips. "It's funny," she said, almost to herself. "People think the world is too big for one small act to matter, but it's moments like this that remind you it's not." Another firefighter chimed in, his tone reflective. "It's easy to get jaded in this job. You see a lot, you lose a lot. But tonight, that kid showed us something we don't see enough of: genuine kindness." Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the quiet impact left behind in that small McDonald's. But for those inside, the moment stuck, a memory they'd carry with them, retelling it to family and friends, not because of who he was, but because of what he did. And maybe, just maybe, Barron's actions that night would inspire someone else to do the same. Not for recognition, not for applause, but simply because kindness has a way of rippling outward, touching lives in ways no one can predict. If there's one lesson to take from this story, it's this: never underestimate the power of a single act of generosity. Whether you're the son of a president or just someone passing through, your actions have the potential to make someone feel seen, valued, and appreciated. If this story moved you, take a moment to think about how you can bring a little unexpected kindness into someone's day. And don't forget to share this video and subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us what humanity is capable of when we show compassion. But most importantly, remember, it's the quiet moments of kindness that leave the loudest echoes.